Good morning, everyone. It being a little past 9 o'clock, we'll call to order the House Judiciary Committee, and we will begin as usual by pledging allegiance. And Representative Smith, would you like to lead us today in the Pledge of Allegiance? Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You can be seated. Mr. Clerk, would you like to take the roll? Here.
Here. Here. Here. Here.
Good morning, everyone. Our first item of business today is a hearing. It's a hearing on Senate Bill 399FN relative to certain provisions of the Fetal Life Protection Act requiring an ultrasound examination. I have a number of cards this morning. What we have done in the past is and I want to just begin by saying that everyone who has signed in so far has signed up in support of the bill. No one has signed up in opposition to the bill today. What we typically do is allow the sponsors to talk for up to 5 minutes to introduce the bill, and generally what we try to do is hold everybody to approximately 3 minutes in speaking time today. And frankly, I think only one person's asked for a little bit more than 3 minutes. The primary sponsor of this bill is Senator Rosenwald, and I see Senator Rosenwald, you're there. Would you like to introduce your bill today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I'm Cindy Rosenwald from Senate District 13, which is the majority part of Nashua, and I will not be speaking for 5 minutes. I'm here to introduce Senate Bill 399. This bill will clarify that ultrasound is only required prior to performing an abortion at least 24 weeks into pregnancy. We've been told that it was never the intention of the 24-week ban sponsors, the original sponsors, that ultrasound would be required in all cases. Therefore, it's important to make this clarification and remove an unnecessary procedure and expense to patients when ultrasound is not the clinical standard of care. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Senator Rosenwald? Seeing none, thank you for your brief testimony today. Ian Hewitt. I think you have to turn on the microphone. There's a little button there. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Yep. Ian Hewitt, in support of Senate Bill 399. This discussion together a number of times, and I will not repeat myself unnecessarily. I'll just point to the implications of some changed circumstances. The House has, of course, House Bill 1609, which would create an exception to our current law for cases of fatal fetal abnormalities. That means two things that are important should the committee consider an amendment which removes enforcement capacity from our current law and/or which creates an open-ended exception. First, at least as far as the House is concerned, we are now talking about a law which is even more moderate than the law which was in place in Massachusetts prior to December of 2020, which was a 24-week abortion prohibition with no exception for fetal anomalies. Secondly, because the House has already spoken on the issue of fatal fetal abnormalities, should the committee pursue the kind of amendment that I've described, the children whose deaths would be authorized would be children who are both older than 24 weeks and are medically viable. In other words, children who could have lived had they been delivered instead of killed on the day of their abortion. Not unlike, of course, some of the children whose corpses were recently discovered in Washington, D.C., which is a jurisdiction where the abortion provider who killed them will not face so much as a parking ticket. That is the same impunity that an abortion provider would have enjoyed in New Hampshire prior to January of this year. I pray that that fact would be of some moral significance to the members of the committee. Thank you, and I would be happy to take any questions about the bill, the law, or related legal issues.
Are there any questions for Mr. Hewitt? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Kayla Montgomery.
Good morning, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Kayla Montgomery. I am the Vice President of Public Affairs for Planned Parenthood of Northern New England and our sister Action Fund. We are here today to support Senate Bill 399, and I will stick to the bill before you. This committee is, has a lot of background on this bill already, so I will be very brief. Prior to January 1st of 2022, this year, conducting an ultrasound prior to an abortion was up to a clinician's best medical judgment. The provider could work directly with the patient on whether an ultrasound was necessary. But on January 1st, the ultrasound provision went into effect, and it is written in such a way that requires all patients in New Hampshire seeking an abortion to undergo an ultrasound, whether medically necessary or not. This provision is currently impacting patients who are seeking abortion care early in pregnancy. So those who are prior to 11 weeks know the date of their last menstruation and have no risk factors. The ultrasound for those patients are not always medically necessary, but they are now required to have one under the current law. So under this current law, again, ultrasounds are mandatory no matter the individual circumstance or the recommendation of the clinician. So we support Senate Bill 399 because it clarifies the ultrasound requirement in relation to the newly enacted abortion ban. So rather than prior to all abortion care, which is the current law. So this bill before you is one of three bills that would currently address the ultrasound requirement, the other being House Bill 1673, which will be on the Senate floor tomorrow, same language. And then, of course, House Bill 1609, which passed out of the House with broad bipartisan support just last month. Again, that is the same language as well. But in terms of this bill before you, we would ask you to pass this current bill, Senate Bill 399. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions from Ms. Montgomery?
Thank you.
Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Representative Stapleton.
Walter Stapleton, Claremont Ward 3, Sullivan County, District 5. I rise in support of SB 399 FN, and I'm happy that the amendment 0333S was incorporated into the bill to provide that clarity that we need to for the ultrasound at or near the 24-week period. It's time to affirm this bill in our legislature, in our law body, to protect viable life in the womb in the third trimester. While this bill, it still gives us reasonable ability for people to make decisions in the first and second trimester, So if there's any question about what to do or when to do it, there's fully 6 months for a woman and her family partner to make that decision. Most of the abortions, by the statistics, occur in the first trimester, and some then in the second, very few, much fewer in the third. And this is when life is viable. This is when we have a living, breathing, well, not yet breathing, but a living and viable child in the womb. And to take that life that late is a travesty. And I'm glad that New Hampshire is at the point where we can step back from that travesty and write this good legislation into law. And I'm hoping that you will pass it, and it will be affirmed in our statutes to protect that viable and valuable and valued life in the womb. Thank you.
Sorry, any questions for Representative Stapleton? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Sarah Hole, is it?
As just stated, my name is Sarah Hole, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My hope is that today, Bill SB 399 will not be turned into a gutting bill for the FLPA. That is the Fatal Life Protection Act. There have been multiple attempts this year for that bill to be, or act, to be changed or modified to not protect the unborn. I understand many of those in support of abortion want to remove the FLPA since abortion is seen as a morally correct act. After all, it protects women's rights. As a woman, I am full in support of rights for my sex. The issue with abortion, however, is not over women's rights, as often portrayed. Many different arguments raised distract from the core issue. When does an embryo become human? To be clear, when I use the word human, I'm referring to someone equal to the rest of humanity in value and who has the right to life. If an embryo is not a human, there is no issue with abortion. If the embryo is human, then abortion is murder. Every other matter is secondary to this one question. Once it's resolved, any other matter regarding abortion can be easily answered. 5 elements change between conception and birth regarding the embryo: size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, and level of consciousness. Let's start with size. How does size give human life value? Humans range in different sizes, but does not affect the value we have or the rights we possess as American citizens. Human value is greater than physical appearance. Level of development. Born babies are less developed than children. Children are less developed than teens. When does level of development make someone else more valued? Environment. Someone's environment does not change their value. Someone cannot travel to any location in the universe and become less valuable. To say a child's value hinges on the journey of 8 inches is ridiculous. Why bother with a C-section if they're not valuable until outside the womb? Degree of dependency. The comatose and disabled are all dependent on others. Born babies are dependent on their guardians, if not more so than an embryo. Degree of consciousness. Consciousness does not impact value. Someone in a coma is not less valuable. Someone with a severe mental disorder is not less valuable. In the end, what makes a human valuable is that they are human. There's no extra criteria for a human to have worth. The minute someone tries to place one on an embryo, there will always be another human that is an exception. When did being human no longer be enough to have the right to life? Abortion is not protecting women's rights, nor is it moral. I hope today you'll let BS 399 pass without modifying it to remove more of the FLPA. In the future, I hope you will continue to fight for the rights of those who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you for your time.
Are there any questions for Ms. Hole? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Karen Manaski.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today.
Good morning.
I am Karen Manaski. I'm a retired occupational therapist with degrees in biology and occupational therapy. I'm also the mother of 3 twin sons and a child whose life ended in an abortion clinic over 30 years ago. I'm here to urge the committee to vote ought to pass on Senate Bill 399 as amended by the Senate. By doing so, you would be strengthening an already sound late-term abortion ban in a state that protects viably late-term children just weeks before their birth. I oppose any attempt to amend the law in committee in a way that would render it unenforceable and incapable of defending even a single child. Much has been made of the need to give women absolute say over whether the child they carry lives or dies, but few speak of that child who, through no fault of their own, is killed before even being able to take a single breath outside the womb. A child's right to live can't only be based on whether they are convenient or wanted. Certainly, we can balance reasonable protections for viable preborn while still providing women ample opportunity to seek an abortion if that is their decision. To hear those who oppose any restrictions, you would think women always make loving, supportive, and knowledgeable decisions to terminate the young lives they carry. That was not my experience. As a young woman, like so many, I was faced with an unexpected pregnancy with a father who did not want the child. Unsupported, afraid, and panicked, I scraped up the money for an abortion, and I walked in alone. No one had told me the violence of what was to come. If you haven't felt the pain of having life torn out of your body by force, you couldn't understand. There was no connection, no compassion from the doctor who never introduced herself to me and never acknowledged me before painfully violating my body and ending the life of my child. And this was in my first 3 months of pregnancy. We need to take a moment and think about these fully formed children in the last trimester and what has to happen to forcibly end their lives. We argue on the margins of extreme examples and ignore those children who have a true chance at life. A 24-week ban with exceptions for the health of the mother is not extreme. And for those women who still want to abort their late-term children, there are bordering states that would be happy to accommodate them, just as New Hampshire no doubt did when we had abortion on demand for any reason up to the moment of birth. I urge the committee to pass Senate Bill 399 as currently amended by the Senate and keep these modest protections in place for those who cannot defend themselves. Thank you for listening.
Are there any questions? Thank you for your testimony today. Laura L. Azem.
Good morning. My name is Laura El-Azam. I'm from Londonderry. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to look at my notes for a quick moment. I have had the opportunity to talk to people in my community about the bills that are before the legislature this year regarding the 24-week abortion restriction. And most of them understand what the Fetal Life Protection Act is and that it was just recently enacted. And they're wondering why we would mess with it so quickly after it was enacted. You know, why don't we just give it a chance to work and see how it goes? Most of them, like a strong majority of New Hampshire citizens and Americans, support restrictions on abortion. And they recognize that what we have now has moved New Hampshire from an extreme position, enabling abortion up until birth, to a more mainstream, albeit still permissive, abortion position. And most are familiar with the ultrasound procedure, and were kind of baffled to hear over the course of last summer and fall that there was a media campaign that very aggressively pushed the ultrasound wording as intrusive, extraordinary, extreme, and really that portrayal was just baffling to most of the people I had spoken with who had been pregnant before and gone through the usual doctor's appointments. But given this bad information in the media, I do support the clarification of the ultrasound wording, and therefore I just strongly support SB 399 as amended by the Senate, and I hope that you will pass it as such and not change the wording in any ways now. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Kathy, is it Peternal?
You take the box away. Good morning, and thank you for hearing my testimony in support of Senate Bill 399 as amended by the Senate. This is the second time this session that I have come before the House Judiciary Committee. I have also testified regarding House Bill 1673. Considering the similarity between these bills, that written testimony is included as well. My name is Katie Peternell. I live in Wolfboro with my husband. We raised 4 daughters there. I have a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. I stand before you today as a woman who has had far too many experiences surrounding life issues. As an adoptee, as a birth mother, as the grandmother of a beautiful 5-month-old grandson from an unplanned, unwed pregnancy, as a friend of women who have shared their stories of abortion, as an attendee of retreats to heal the suffering of post-abortive women, and the mother of a son who was delivered early at 23 weeks gestation. I think I have a very valid opinion on the Fetal Life Protection Act and attempts to amend or repeal it. Of all of my experiences, I think that the most pertinent to today's hearing is the emergent delivery of my son at 23 weeks. In order to save 1 life, as opposed to losing 2, he was delivered via C-section, followed by a hysterectomy. The surgery to save my life lasted 8 hours and required the transfusion of 4 units of blood. This decision was not one my husband and I took lightly, and I was willing to die to save the life of my son. The night before the surgery, I will never forget lying in the hospital bed, feeling my son kicking and moving around. He was very active. While I lay there, I kept silently asking him to please stop moving. Please stop moving. After the surgery, they brought the body of my 23-week-old son to me. Although I was in the stupor of anesthesia, I can still, 18 years later, see that perfectly formed body, an entire human being, a baby only 1 week younger than the narrow ultrasound requirement in Senate Bill 399. When you vote on this bill as amended by the Senate, please think about what a 24-week gestation baby looks like and vote to support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your coming and for your testimony today. J.R. Hole. Okay. He signed in support in any event. Greg Handy.
Good morning. I'm Greg Handy from Bedford, a retired military officer, father of 6. First of all, I want to thank you as our representatives because I know it's not an easy job and it takes a lot of time and commitment. I am here in support of the bill and of all protections for human life. I'm here to help support you in fulfilling your moral duty before God, because he said, we shall not kill. Also to support you in your duty to the Constitution, which is to protect the life and liberty of every human being, born and unborn. Collectively, we have a duty, and you are our conscience, sending us to enact laws that conform to God. When the Supreme Court in '73 allowed abortion, it was a violation against the law of God and the Constitution. And your duty, our collective duty, is to change it. It's not an option. I was, I think, 14, watching Walter Cronkite with my father, hearing the announcement of that decision. And my father, who had a career in human services, taking care of the mentally, physically disabled, said to me, "Greg, it'll get worse, as bad as this is. You'll see the death of the elderly and the forced killing of the disabled." And you may say that doesn't happen now, but if we don't stop this, it will. Case in point, University of Pittsburgh publicized on their website their experiments of taking live human tissue off of aborted babies and grafting them on rodents. They're also doing similar procedures with other organs. And from a FOIA request, we've learned that the US government and its academic partners prefer fresh and never frozen baby body parts, meaning that the specimens, these babies, were murdered alive. I can't believe that we're debating that whether there's human life here or not. We know that life begins at conception from the union of the sperm and the egg. And I lost my train of thought here. But if there's any doubt, it's to look at photos of aborted babies. And it's gruesome. And these babies from to where you really can't discern the form to where they're fully formed. And those are the photos that we all need to look at to remind ourselves of this duty. What is abortion? There's many types. There's the use of medication that causes the premature miscarriage of the child. There's a dilation and curettage, where the baby is basically sucked out of the womb and oftentimes dismembered through that procedure. There's dilation and evacuation, where the baby is actually physically dismembered and suctioned out. And then there's induction abortion, where the baby is injected with a poison that causes cardiac arrest and induced labor. Often the woman has to carry that baby dead for 2 or 3 days before the body naturally expels it. This is not just to the baby or to the woman. What's even more upsetting is that 40, 50 years ago, this would have been, we would have been aghast at this. It's these types of crimes which Nuremberg, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, the trials were held to hold account on these abuses. Part of what Nuremberg went after were crimes against humanity, which were defined as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportment, and other inhumane acts committed against any civil population. In response, many of the perpetrators were held to justice, and what resulted was the Nuremberg Code. 10 points, 3 of which are most relevant. 1, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The next, the experiment should be avoided, or I should say, should be conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. And the next is, no experiment should be conducted where there is a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur. Well, abortion goes way beyond this. As we know, it takes the life. If it didn't, why would we even have the procedure? So, in conclusion, I think it's quite obvious what the moral duty is. The duty before God, the duty in conformance to the Constitution, and I ask that you always support the right to life. And thank you for your help.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you again. Rusan Chester?
Thank you, Committee Chair. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Committee Chair. Thank you, committee members. My name is Russ-Ann Chester. I'm a resident of Bedford, New Hampshire, and I was born in the 60s, but I was fortunate enough not to have a lot of problems, even though I was born premature, and possibly at or right around that 24-week gestation period. That being said, I think anytime we're taking out ultrasounds, the abortion process is different depending on what trimester the woman is in. Not having an ultrasound in the abortion, for every abortion, not having the for second or third term trimesters, you are taking the chance of not only having a botched abortion, and I'm sure you folks now have seen a lot of these babies that have been born, who are now young children and teenagers from these botched abortions. If you haven't, check it out. It's pretty awful what they've gone through. With regards to that, third trimester abortions are extremely dangerous for it being a botched abortion, but it's also extremely dangerous for the woman who's made that choice. It's something they don't tell you. I am someone who had an abortion because I thought it was my right, my body, my choice. I had an abortion, and I finally realized 15 years later that that choice carried a lot of consequences for me. It carried a lot of consequences emotionally and physically. I lied about how far along I was on purpose so that I could have the procedure. I was entitled. I beg all of you to really look at this. I just found out last night that according to our state laws, if a woman dies during the abortion process, the abortion clinic is not required to notify the coroner. They notify their emergency contact, and the emergency contact does that. That's part of the reason why we don't see women in our state dying from botched abortions. I suspect. I need to look into that further. On the market in 2022 to prevent abortions, there's absolutely no reason to have to be doing this kind of process, at least without the ultrasound being included. And I feel most importantly that provided the appropriate education, if these clinics truly provided the appropriate education to the woman about all the different options that are available to them, that we would see abortion go down drastically. I also am a birth mom. I released a child for adoption. After my abortion, 15 years later, I found myself pregnant again. This time I made the adoption option available for her because I had learned how traumatic the choice of abortion is for women. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Representative Horgan, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Ms. Chester, I know you've been heavily involved in the COVID issue, and I know a number of women of childbearing age who are pregnant who've died from COVID. And I don't know if you know the number, you can probably, if you happen to know the number, you can share it with us, maybe not, because that involves both the death of not just the mother, but of the fetus, or sometimes 2 or 3 fetuses that the mother is carrying.
I think I need you to repeat the question. I don't know what that has to do with this bill before us today.
Okay, so I was just asking about the issue of pregnant women who die of COVID, and in which case they're not just you're not just losing the pregnant woman, but you're also losing the baby, or in some cases multiple fetuses who the woman is carrying. And
Well, the interesting part of that is if you identify that the thing that is growing inside the woman's stomach as a baby, then abortion should be a crime against humanity. If you don't, if you say, no, it's just a bunch of cells, then that's a different story. But that's the bottom line here. So I guess first we have to identify what is a baby. When does that gestational age become a baby? If you want to say, okay, at 25 weeks it's a baby, then that's another story. Is that they don't particularly, they don't ever involve the fetus, regardless of the gestational age. And in a lot of situations, some of these pregnant women that have died from COVID have died from the treatments of the COVID-19 situation and not actually from COVID. So it's very hard to tease out right now. We're only 2 years in to what COVID is. We don't know what the vaccine's going to do to the unborn baby, or if you don't recognize it as a baby, then the fetus. We don't know the long-term effects for COVID-19 and or the vaccine at this point. So I do know that more pregnant women have died from car accidents, and their babies have died from car accidents than they have from COVID-19.
Thank you, Representative McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. I just wanted to clarify your position a little bit, because are you in support of the bill, or do you think that it goes too far with respect to removing some of the requirements for ultrasound? So just looking to clarify what your position was on the bill.
I want to, because I didn't have the bill before the amendment was in, so I want to read through it. I will send an email whether or not I support or oppose. I was in a different hearing. But one of the things I want to be clear is that I understand that because of Roe versus Wade, and because we have granted women the choice, and I'm not going to go there as whether that was right or wrong. It's history. What I'm saying is that look at what we did with prohibition. That didn't work. So making abortion completely illegal in our state may not be the way to go, because then again, we're putting women in position that they're still going to do it. They're just going to have to do it without appropriate oversight and care. Personally, what I would like to see is a lot more reporting with regards to the responsibility of the agencies that are performing these abortions, and that having an ultrasound involved would help to start making those numbers come a little more to light in the state of New Hampshire.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony today. And again, I'll call J.R. Hole.
Thank you, Chairman. Can everybody hear me? Good. So I'm going to start by reading from our Constitution, because as best I can tell, there's no carve-outs regarding the age of the person. Part First, Article 2, all men have certain natural, essential, and inherent rights among them, which are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring possession, and possessing and protecting property, and in a word, seeking and obtaining happiness. Our Constitution is an incredible document crafted by some brilliant men. Those men would be turning over in their graves today if they saw what was going on, both with our country as well as where we are in terms of abortion. I haven't run into anybody so far who had a child who wished that they had aborted the child. I have run into some women, though, who had an abortion who subsequently said, I didn't make a good choice. I wish I knew now what I knew. I wish I knew then what I know now. The bill is a step in the right direction. I think it needs to go a lot further, but it's at least a part in terms of, I would draw the line not at 6 months. I would draw the line a lot further back, but at least it changes the status from where we are today to a state that doesn't allow third trimester abortions, perfectly viable babies, to be slaughtered. Everybody that I've talked to who had an abortion comes back and says, you know, wish I hadn't done that. I miss that kid. When are we going to learn as a nation that every life is sacred? The Constitution is clear. There's no carve-outs regarding gestational age. There's no carve-outs regarding whether they're handicapped or not. Every life has equal value. With that, I would ask that you would support and pass SB 399 as sent over from the Senate. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. That completes the number of sign-in cards that I have. Is there anyone else who wishes to testify here today? Seeing no one, I will declare the hearing on Senate Bill 399 closed and indicate to the committee that I obviously misjudged the amount of time it would take this morning. And we are scheduled for our next hearing at 10:30, which will give everybody, I think, opportunity to get some coffee. So we'll see you all back here. We'll recess until 10:30. Good morning, everyone. We'll call this meeting of the House Judiciary Committee back to order. Our next item of business this morning is a hearing on Senate Bill 243, permitting transfer on death deeds for real property. The primary sponsor of this bill is Senator Lou D'Alessandro. I see he is with us this morning. And Senator D'Alessandro, would you like to introduce your bill?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It'd be an honor and a privilege to bring this bill before one of my former colleagues in the Senate, and a man who's had a wonderful career on the judiciary. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Former Senator Good, former Judge Good, now Representative Good. You've got a lot of titles. I come before you as the prime sponsor of Senate Bill 243, permitting transfer on death deeds for real property. This bill would add a whole new section to our estate laws permitting the transfer on death of deeds for real property. There are many advantages, including tax advantages, but the most important is avoiding probate. Many states already have this legislation in statute, but it will be a new section of law for New Hampshire. This bill, she's here. Where is she? She's just behind me on my left. It's a very, very simple bill. A beneficiary may disclaim all or part of the beneficiary's interest as provided by RSA 563-B, but shall do so within 60 days of the transferor's death. The beneficiary shall record a copy of the disclaimer in the Registry of Deeds of the county in which the property or interest disclaimer is located. Mr. Chairman, that's the context of the legislation. The constituent is here to address queries that you might have. To me, it was simplicity. We know probate's problematic. I'm sure many of you have had calls from constituents about probate and going through that particular situation. This makes it much easier. It's very simple. It's a process that has been accepted in a number of states around the country. So thank you, sir. Appreciate your attention. And if you have any questions that I can answer, I'll try to do it. If not, others are here who can address them. Yep. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Senator D'Alessandro? Seeing none, Senator, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr.
Nice to see you.
Appreciate it. Always good to see you. Thank you.
Barbara Schultz?
Hi, I'm Barbara Schultz from Goffstown. Thank you for having the hearing, and let me speak on this bill. I'm here in full support of Senate Bill 243, and I hope you will give it your full support as well. It's probably, as Lou said, it's simple. It's probably one of the least controversial bills you'll have to face this legislative session. I would like to emphasize that Senate Bill 243 received no opposing testimony in the Senate committee hearing, and it passed unanimously through committee and the full Senate. In November of 2021, I hope you will look at SB 243 today with an open mind and a fresh set of eyes and ears. The fact that this transfer on death deed bill originated in both houses of our state legislature is a strong indicator that the people of New Hampshire want and need this. HB 124, the bill you heard in November, was referred to interim study, and I will address the concerns that arose with regard to that bill later in my testimony. A transfer on death deed is a simple, inexpensive estate planning tool not currently available in New Hampshire. It should be noted that 31 states allow this, and I feel it should be allowed here. I am a single person whose main and basically only asset is my home. I have a very small estate other than my home. I want to avoid the very public, time-consuming, and expensive probate process. I'm not trying to avoid taxes. I'm not trying to avoid creditors. I'm trying to avoid the very expensive and public probate process. The transfer on death deed that SB 243 that you have before you now would allow, when passed, would resolve this issue for me and for many others in New Hampshire. It will allow me to avoid probate without incurring legal bills or setting up a trust, which can be a very expensive process. A transfer on death deed is easy and importantly inexpensive to set up, and it is revocable or changeable, also without undue expense, also important. I will now address the concerns raised by this committee, which were brought up in HB 124. The summary report of your committee member, Representative Troy Mernez, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Murner, stated that the bill was referred for further study due to unknown effects on the following three things. Unknown effect for banks holding mortgages. There is no effect on banks holding mortgages. Transfer on death deeds does not avoid liens, it does not avoid creditors, it doesn't do away with any mortgages, there's no effect. Another concern was the procedures at the Registry of Deeds, also no effect. It's no different than changing a deed for a person's house to a trust, retitling the deed for the trust, retitling the deed for joint with right of survivorship. It's no different. It's just recording a deed. It's very simple. The other concern was effect on estate plans, future and current. Well, yes, it would have an effect on future estate plans because now there would be another option available to New Hampshire residents, and an inexpensive one. As far as affecting current estate plans, I suppose someone who has already paid to set up a trust would have the option of doing this. I don't know why they would. I don't think it would have an effect on a current estate plan, but if it did, it's open to someone's choice to make that decision. I'm not a lawyer, but I'd like to also emphasize that two of your colleagues who do have legal expertise, Senator Perkins Quokra and Representative Barb Griffin, are in support of this bill. Representative Barbara Griffin had communicated with me that she was unfortunately not able to be here today due to chairing her executive session of her own House committee. The transfer on death deed is a useful estate planning tool that should be available to New Hampshire residents, and it is needed and supported by same. I'm counting on your support of SB 243. Thank you. I will take questions if there are any.
Are there questions for Ms. Schultz? Representative Chase.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. I'm just looking at this quickly, but can you tell me what would be considered a small estate? Like, where would the line be drawn?
I don't know that, and I'm not a lawyer, but this transfer on death deed would be available to anyone, small or large.
Representative McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. With respect to the banks holding mortgages, in the other 31 states where this legislation has been enacted, if property, the deed is transferred, is the mortgage just transferred as well, or what's the mechanism
Yes,
for
the
that?
mortgage is not discharged, everything just stays the same. You know, the simplest way to think about a transfer on death deed is sort of like a joint with right of survivorship title, where, you know, if I had a spouse and the deed would be titled joint with right of survivor and I passed away, my spouse would be on the deed, but with whatever liens, mortgages, or anything came with the property. And the transfer on death deed works similarly, except it's, I would assume, primarily for single people. But not necessarily, because again, I'm not a lawyer. It's just another tool in the toolbox that I don't see any reason why New Hampshire doesn't have it. And I did email the committee when this first came to my attention, was in an article in the Union Leader, and I was all over it. And I said, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I need. And then come to find out, we didn't have it in New Hampshire, hence why I'm here. I don't know why the Union Leader ran it without checking first, but in any case, that's what brought me here. But there's many other resources I can send to you from, you know, the different legal sites and so forth.
Are there other questions for Ms. Schultz?
Thank you.
Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Susan
Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Susan Cragen. I am the Register of Deeds for Merrimack County, New Hampshire, but I am testifying right now on my own behalf. And the reason for that is that the Registry of Deeds doesn't think that the bill affects the registry enough to make it something that the registries as a whole should testify about. However, when we were discussing it, we noticed one particular section that we thought might cause problems, and that's why I'm testifying in opposition, and only to this one section, and that is 563 D10. Notice, delivery, acceptance, and consideration are not required. So what does this mean? This means that ownership can be thrust upon perhaps an unwilling recipient. And let me tell you a little bit about what happened to me recently. And this was just in the context of a will, not in the context of this type of deed. My husband was bequeathed by will 1/4 of a house when his mother died, and he immediately disclaimed the gift, which he was entitled to do because it was a will and probate. Why? Because he didn't want the property, and there were good reasons for it. There were environmental hazards that my husband had notice of. The water wasn't potable. There was black mold in the basement. Decades-old fir trees grew within a couple of feet of the house, one of which could crush the tiny house in the right wind. The wood pile had been kept too close to the house, and there was bug infestation. 2, there were obligations that ran with the land that he didn't want to take on, including partial responsibility for keeping a watercourse clear. 3, he thought a creditor lien might exceed the real value of the property. He had cash that the bank could go after in a deficiency judgment. 4, ownership would be partial among 4 siblings, 3 of whom wanted to keep the house for sentimental reasons. One of these, we suspected, was insolvent and knew was irresponsible with money, and a second mentioned using it as a weekend retreat for a religious group we disliked. And those were the 2 siblings he got along with. If my husband had not disclaimed under the will, he would have had to take time to go to New York State, get a lawyer to arrange the transfer with expenses and headaches. The American Association of Retired Persons thinks there are good reasons to decline a bequest of real property. It's a good tax move. For instance, if the property would then go to your child, who has a lower tax consequence. It's a dog of a property. Property taxes can eat up unpaid property taxes, environmental risk, and other reasons. 3, it will trigger a government aid eligibility review. For instance, for Medicaid, you can't have more than $2,000 in assets. Suppose you give this property to my mother, who's in a nursing home and who Medicaid is paying for, but if she has more than $2,000 of assets, they will stop. 4, it will trigger a family drama. And this is important in New Hampshire because a lot of these properties are likely to be summer cottages, things with memories. 5, it will go to your creditors. Are you on the brink of bankruptcy? Do you really care if you get one more small asset? And 6, it's the right thing to do. Now, suppose that in addition to all this, the beneficiary does not get notice of the death or of the transfer of property to himself right away. Suppose before I die, suppose it's me doing it, I execute a transfer on death deed on a toxic dump to a person I don't know but despise, or who's difficult to locate. What happens then? And I'm sure that towns always want to know where to send their tax bills. That's one major problem with this bill, that there's no notice and there's no acceptance. And it becomes a big problem for the recipients sometimes. And for that reason and that reason alone, I am testifying in opposition to this bill as written. I think that there should be a requirement for notice and acceptance on the deed itself. Any questions?
Are there questions for Ms. Cragen? Yes, Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. I'm going to preface this with that I am not, oh, sorry, I'm going to take this off. I am not a lawyer, so everybody else might understand this, but so when it says notice or delivery without notice or delivery to or acceptance by the designated beneficiary during the transferor's life, does that mean that the person who is deeded the land can decline the transfer after the transferor has died? Or, oh, will you go to the microphone? Because other people may have the same question, may not.
See, that's the problem. There is a period where property ownership is ambiguous. And I think that ambiguity is not a good thing. So you don't need ownership. Here's the problem. No matter how small that transfer period is, there's still a point in time where the ownership of the land is unknown, is entirely unknown. So let's say my neighbor across the street wills me her house after having, and then leaves me a letter saying that she hopes that I'll take care of her son or something like that. If I get the property, no, that's a bad example. There's no provision in there that requires notice to be given to me and then requires me to accept it, okay? Now, if apparently there's the possibility that I can turn it down at some point in the future once I get notice of the transfer, but suppose I don't get notice right away. How long does that happen? How long does that take? And let's suppose that I start telling people that I just got notice after I found out there's toxic waste on there. Then it becomes a question of fact for the court, probably, but it could lead to messy litigation. And what I'm saying is that this bill could be made dramatically better by the addition of a notice requirement and a line on that deed that says that the recipient agrees to the transfer. And I don't think that's a big thing to ask. And the other thing is, too, I complained about this bill to the Uniform Law Commission, which drafted it. And I got a letter back from the draftor that was, that didn't address the point. He didn't understand why definite ownership of property is an important thing and can be a problem. And I don't think also, I mean, I think everybody's taking it from the point of view of the person who has the estate, the person who wants to give away their small land holding to a descendant. And that's a fine thing to do. I have no problem with that at all. But you have to consider all the ramifications of this bill.
Okay. Are there other questions? Representative Chase?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. I'm not a lawyer either, and I want to try to clarify. So right now, if somebody has a deed on a property, they don't have to write a little note saying this is where I want the property to go. So say I passed away and I had left a note in my dresser drawer that my property was to go to my son. Is that the way things go now? I'm just trying to figure out, is that what you're talking about with the property, if it's not on the deed and writing that little bit of a couple of lines, you just have to wait until something turns up?
Exactly. According to this bill, the only paper you need is the deed itself. And then you file the deed with the Registry of Deeds. And then that's all you need is that one piece of paper. So, if the piece of paper is lost, let's say, then who knows, how do you find out where that property has gone?
Other questions? Representative McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. So the bill does allow you to disclaim the benefit, but the language on page 2 does explicitly state that a transfer on death deed is effective without notice or delivery. And it's actually not an omission, but it's explicit in here that you do not have to have a notice of delivery or acceptance. So unfortunately, the prime sponsor is not here. Do you know why that explicit language was included in the bill?
I have no idea. I have asked the other registries of deeds, and we have no idea. It doesn't make any logical sense to me, and I think it's incorrect.
Follow up.
Are you aware in the other 31 states that were referenced, if they have other explicit, because it's a very explicit provision, you're right, that says acceptance designated notice or delivery to the, or acceptance by the designated beneficiary during the transfer's life is not required. So it is explicit. Do the other states have that as well?
I don't know about the other states, but it is possible that in addition to having passed the bill, there are other requirements somehow, or that the bill's been added on to, saying that if the property isn't claimed within a certain amount, it reverts back. Here's the problem with listening to the Uniform Law Commission. If you pass their bill, they say it's passed, whether you edit it or not. And I don't know if any of the states have edited it or added on to it, or if there's another superseding law that adds requirements to it. So I don't know that, but I do know that looking at a chart that says that 31 states passed the bill doesn't give you all the information. That's number one. Number two, states have a tendency to pass Uniform Law Commission laws without reading them carefully. And that happened recently with the online notarization bill, and we passed that bill, and we thought it was fine. And it's been revised. And now the Uniform Law Commission says that the law we just passed isn't good enough, and we should pass another one this year. So the Uniform Law Commissioners have good ideas, but they're human, and they make mistakes. And they go back and revise their own work.
Okay. Are there other questions? Thank you for your testimony today.
You're welcome.
Kelly Ovitt Puck.
Good morning. My name is Kelly Ovitt Puck. I'm a real estate attorney here in Concord. I'm testifying in opposition to this bill, and I'm testifying on my own behalf. I'm not testifying on behalf of anyone else. I think the registrar pointed out what the main issue here with this bill is. It offers illusory simplicity, which can be a very dangerous thing, especially for lay people who may not understand the implications of what they're doing. Someone could go out and prepare this deed and have it notarized thinking this is a very simple solution to a problem and not fully understand the ramifications. The transfer of property is complicated. Real estate is often the most important, the most valuable asset somebody has, and it is serious, and it can have ramifications that are serious. And so I think we need to understand that while this may look like a simple solution, it's not that simple, and it may actually create more problems than it solves. One of the main problems has already been discussed and pointed out, which is this notice issue. So the fact that whoever is the named beneficiary isn't required to accept the deed, isn't required to be notified, isn't required to be somebody who is related or alive or, of age. So all of these things create uncertainty, create risk. As to the question about disclaimer, so there is a disclaimer provision in the proposed statute. It allows the beneficiary to disclaim within 60 days of the transferor's death. So the problem with this is, what if there's a beneficiary who doesn't know about the transferor's death? There's no provision in here that requires any notice to the registry, to the town, of the transferor's death. So we do have this huge uncertainty that's built in when somebody passes away and they've executed one of these deeds. And frankly, I think it creates a burden on the registrars and on the towns to try and figure out who these beneficiaries are, where they are located, if they're still alive. If they're not alive, what happens? We do have a probate process for a reason. It provides order, it provides notice, we have rules, and it provides opportunity for people to understand the process and have the process of transfer of property, which is very important and serious, be taken seriously. In addition, I'd like to point out we already do have a process to transfer property without going through probate, and it's through the creation of a trust, which often does require going to an attorney and getting advice of counsel, but that's appropriate, and it doesn't have to be super expensive. I think there are some other attorneys who will be testifying a little bit more about that. I kind of practice on the real estate side of things, so I'm more focused on how it affects title, how it might affect creditors. Another thing that I want to point out about the uncertainty and the risk with title of not knowing what the status of title is and who the owner is that there's an 18-month period in the statute that the property will still be subject to claims of the state. So that means there's an 18-month period where we don't know for sure, is this property going to be subject to these claims? That makes it very likely that whoever is the beneficiary is not going to be able to do anything with this property during that 18-month period without opening a probate anyway. So it's unlikely that any lender is going to lend money that's secured by that property. It's unlikely that any title insurer is going to insure title to that property during that period. And then we have this whole period where that beneficiary could go out and transfer the property, and then it may still be subject to creditors' claims, and we have to unravel all of that. It could be very messy. It just creates a lot of risk of confusion and uncertainty that I think isn't really apparent with what seems like a very simple idea. Another defect that I would like the committee to consider about this statute is that it doesn't offer a whole lot of guidance. There are no forms attached. It talks about the possibility, not only the transfer of death on death deed, but it also talks about an instrument of revocation. There's no forms provided for that. So again, we're not offering the kind of guidance that we need to provide to both people who want to take advantage of this, but also others, title insurers, creditors, other third parties who may have interest in this property. Are the forms sufficient? Is what's been done adequate? So that's another defect that I think really needs to be looked at before this bill is seriously considered for passage. I think that's the bulk of what I'd like to say. Again, I am a real estate attorney, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Representative Wolper first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. Would you spell your name for me, please?
Certainly. It's O, V as in Victor, I, T as in Tom, another T as in Tom, space, P as in Peter, U as in umbrella, and C as in cat. Ovit Puck.
Okay. Are you all set?
No, but I'll talk to her after.
I think I know I can give that. Representative McLean, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I'm sensitive to the testimony about the notice and acceptance and on the disclaimer side, but I am just trying to reconcile in my mind why the bill put in explicit language saying that notification is not required. So are you aware of any reason why that kind of language would have been put in the bill? I know you're not the prime sponsor, but...
Well, this is just speculation, but it does give more flexibility for people who want to do this and don't necessarily want to notify the beneficiaries or track them down. That's you know, and maybe some of the other people who will testify have a better idea, but that's the only insight I have to offer is added flexibility.
Other questions? Representative Chase, did you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. Again, I'm just trying to wrap my head around the land holding. Because one person said there wasn't it could be a large land holding or small, and then the last person who testified from Merrimack Deeds said she was talking about small land holdings. How large of an estate are we talking about that someone can just leave the property to somebody?
My understanding is that this would apply no matter the size of the estate. That you could use a transfer of death deed regardless of the size of the estate.
Other questions? Typically, in a real estate transfer, if you just do a deed, there is paperwork associated with that, which would notify the federal government, but notify the towns of the transfer. And it appears that that's not required as a part of this. If you're not notifying the recipient, potential recipient of the property, how can you, I guess the question is, how can you properly notify the town?
I agree. I think that's an issue. So when the deed is recorded, there will be notice. It will be recorded at the registry, and there will be notice. But there's no notice required to the beneficiary. There's no kind of validating the beneficiary as somebody who actually exists, who is alive, they have a valid address, all of that. And there's no notice required to the beneficiary. There's also no notice that the actual effectiveness of the transfer is triggered by the transfer's death, and there's no notice required for that. So that's a huge gap here.
Other questions? No, you can't. So okay. Thank you for you.
Can I make one final comment? And I should have said this before. A lot of statutes are interrelated. And so one thing that I would urge this committee to consider is if they are going to support this bill, please look at the other statutes that may be affected by this. So for example, what happens if the transferor names their spouse and they get divorced, does that, we have statutes that relate to that, that we have a real estate transfer tax. Does that apply here? So I think it's crucial that if this bill is passed, we think about all of the other statutes that may be impacted, which have been carefully crafted in light of our intestacy scheme, in light of our probate statute and that process. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you for your testimony today. Elise Salick. Ms. Cragen, perhaps at the end we'll give you an opportunity to testify again, but we'll let everybody have an opportunity to testify first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Elise Salick, and I'm an attorney at Soloway & Hollis here in Concord, and I am an estate planner. That is what I do and what I've done for the past 30 years. And I'm here speaking on my own behalf in opposition to SB 243. And I do have some background for the committee on our statute and how it compares to the statutes that have been passed in the other jurisdictions. So just by way of background, I think the committee should be aware that I think it's 29 states in the District of Columbia, not 31 states, have some form of transfer on death deed legislation on the books. Of those jurisdictions, 19 have statutes that are based on the Uniform Real Property Transfer on Death Act. And that is the act that was used as the model for the statute that forms the basis of SB 243. But the problem with our statute, it's one of many problems from my perspective, is that if you take a look at the Uniform Real Property Transfer on Death Act and you compare it to the words that are contained in SB 243, we're missing a third of the statutory language. So the sponsors, the drafters of this statute basically went so far and then stopped. And that's what's creating some of the title issues and some of the concerns that have been raised by Ms. Cragen and by my colleague Kelly Ovitt-Puck. But just to back up a little bit, there are a lot of issues with this statute. I'm not here to say that New Hampshire should not have a transfer on death deed statute. I think we should. I think it would be a valuable tool, not just in my toolbox as an estate planner, but also in the toolbox of lay people who are looking for a simple way to transfer property. So I don't have a philosophical issue with SB 243. I just think the statute is deficient and needs some improvement. And by way of improvement, I'm going to point to one issue that I see a lot in my practice, because I also do probate litigation, and that issue is undue influence. I have a big concern about the elderly population here in New Hampshire being unduly influenced to transfer property to their relatives or their friends. This is an issue that we see every day. And if you take a look at the California version of this statute, I rarely look to California as a model of much, but in this instance, I think California got it right. Because what California did about 5 years ago is they passed their first transfer on death deed statute. And they built a sunset provision in it, a 5-year sunset, for the explicit purpose of looking back 5 years into having transfer on death deeds to identify any problems or issues that had arisen during that 5-year period that then needed to be corrected. And one of the biggest issues that happened in California is fraud and undue influence. So in January of 2021, when the California legislature looked at its transfer on death deed statute after its initial implementation period of 5 years, the first thing that they tweaked were the requirements for signing a valid transfer on death deed. If you take a look at the language of SB 243, right now, in order to sign one of these transfer on death deeds, you need the same capacity that you would have to make a will. And I think that's a good thing. But there are no other requirements. And right now, in order to sign a deed here in New Hampshire, you just have to put your name on the deed in the presence of a notary. There are no witness requirements. And what California has done is they've now added a provision to their statute to try to protect against fraud and undue influence by now requiring that transfer on death deeds be accompanied by 2 witnesses. And they've built a presumption into their statute that says that if the witnesses are also the beneficiaries of the property, their transaction's presumptively invalid. So I think if we're going to make an attempt to introduce or have a transfer on death statute in New Hampshire, we need to tackle the issue of undue influence, and we need to look to California and some of the other states that have had this legislation for a while, and maybe think about adding witness requirements on these deeds. And from my perspective as an estate planner, these deeds are revocable, which is a wonderful thing. You should be able to change your mind about the people you've named in your transfer on death deed. But if you're going to be able to revoke your deed, then you should be able to revoke it under the same legal standards. That too should require witnesses. And so that issue is not addressed at all in SB 243, and I really think it needs to be. Another issue is the issue of contingent beneficiaries, and this is something that Ms. Cragen touched on. What happens if you leave your property in a transfer on death deed to your 2 children and one of them predeceases you? They're just not alive to take the property. Under the current statute that's before you at SB 243, the deceased child's interest lapses. So basically the property goes 100% to your surviving child. As an estate planner, I can tell you that in my practice, parents don't do that. What parents like to say in their wills and in their trusts is that if a child predeceases, the deceased child's interest passes down the line to grandchildren or to great-grandchildren. There's no opportunity in SB 243 to do that. And in some of the more well-crafted transfer on death deed statutes, there is the ability to name contingent beneficiaries. The interest of a deceased beneficiary doesn't just lapse. So again, my position is that if you're going to do this, we should do this right, and we should give the members of the public here in New Hampshire an opportunity to name contingent beneficiaries in their deeds. I think that's an important planning tool. I also have some concerns about electronic signatures. We have an Electronic Signature Act in New Hampshire. You are currently allowed to sign a deed electronically, but there's no mention in SB 243 as to whether transfer on death deeds also are subject to electronic signature requirements. And as Kelly said, there's a lot of interplay between real estate transactions and other statutes. And so the Electronic Signatures Act really needs to be looked at and woven into the fabric of our transfer on death deed legislation if we're going to go this route. My other issue, and this is not addressed at all in SB 243, is what about powers of attorney? If you're incapacitated and you've got a durable power of attorney, one of your kids is paying your bills and taking care of all of your financial affairs, do we think it's appropriate as a matter of public policy to allow agents under durable powers of attorney to sign a transfer on death deed? I don't know the answer to that question, but I know in a lot of the states that have enacted this kind of legislation, there is specific mention in their statute that either permits an agent under a power of attorney to sign one of these deeds on behalf of someone who's incapacitated, or there's an explicit reference in the statute that says you can't allow an agent to sign one of these deeds. I think that issue should also be addressed. And if we do want to address this issue, we're going to have to take a look at our DPOA statute. And we're going to need to make some changes to the Durable Power of Attorney Act to create the powers needed to sign one of these transfer on death deeds on behalf of an incapacitated individual. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. Again, I think that would be a useful tool, but we've got to look at multiple statutes if we want to go that route. My final comment has to do with contesting a transfer on death deed. If there has been fraud or undue influence in the execution of one of these deeds, there needs to be a provision in our statute that permits people to contest that deed. And again, in most of the well-crafted statutes that I've seen, those provisions do exist. So, you know, in wrap-up, my concerns are that our statute is deficient in that it does not contain all of the language that the Model Act contains. There are 30 other jurisdictions out there that have done this before. And if we take a look at their statutes and incorporate the best of what's out there, I think we will have a very good piece of legislation. But I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. Representative Murner.
Yes, on the last piece on contested, so that would be kicked to probate?
Well, that's a good question. Typically, when you're contesting a will or a conveyance that takes effect at death, the Circuit Court Probate Division does have jurisdiction over those claims. But there's nothing in the statute that says that, and so I suspect those claims could be brought in Superior Court. I have no idea, and so the jurisdictional issue does need to be addressed. To me, it makes logical sense if you're going to allow a contest to have that contest heard in the Circuit Court Probate Division. But again, that's an issue of public policy, and it should be addressed in the statute.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. And is it Pam Nankirk?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. Pam Newkirk, Newkirk. I'm also an attorney. I practice in Bedford, New Hampshire, at a law firm, Barradale, O'Connell, Newkirk, and Dwyer. I'm here today testifying on my own behalf. I am in opposition to the bill as written. My practice is limited to probate litigation and messy probate issues. Sometimes that aren't full-blown litigation, but oftentimes I deal with issues that arise with problems with statutory construction and that sort of thing. I wanted to testify a little bit about disclaimer, but I think that issue has been very thoroughly covered by all those who have spoken before me. I just want to reiterate, however, that I think that if, as written, this would be the only type of gift that could be made without the consent of the gift recipient. I think every other type of gift that is made has to be accepted, and our disclaimer statute acknowledges that and allows, without any time limitation, a person to disclaim a gift, whether it's made during the lifetime or upon death, just provided that they have not already exercised indicia of ownership of the property. I think that there's a problem, as Attorney Salick very considerately addressed, with pulling out pieces of a uniform body of law that don't include all the necessary components. The other issue is there may be a uniform act concerning this type of transfer, but in most of the states that have adopted such a thing, they've incorporated it with all the other uniform bodies of law, so that even though it's talking about real estate transfers, it makes reference to probate terms that are defined in that state's uniform probate code, which is something we don't have here in New Hampshire. And when those terms are pulled in, it may make sense to lay people, but then lawyers get to deal with them in court afterwards, and they're trying to figure out what that specific term means when it's part of a defined body of law that we have not adopted. So having said that, I think that there's a general problem with the statute that a lot of the deadlines that are included are triggered by the date of death. And just for edification purposes, probate law is not triggered by date of death. Probate law is triggered by the date that probate is opened. And in fact, most deadlines in probate are defined by the date the administrator is appointed by the court, which may be very far from the date that the probate, the will, and the petition to open probate are filed. So, having said those general things, I'd like to talk specifically about the creditor section of the statute. And I have had some experience with the problems in our current statutory scheme concerning trust property that's available to pay creditors of an estate. And the New Hampshire probate statutes has a very express and clear mechanism for how creditors' claims get filed and paid. Upon the appointment of the administrator, the creditors have 6 months from the date of the appointment of the administrator to file a claim with the court. And then in the second 6 months, if the creditor has some communications with the executor of the estate about getting paid and it appears that the executor does not intend to pay those things, then the creditor has to bring a lawsuit against the estate within that second 6 month period of time and see if their claim is legally viable. And if it is, then the executor has to, or the administrator has to pay that claim. Here, we're talking about creditors' claims being paid within 18 months after the date of death. There's no guarantee that you're going to have an estate open and that you're going to know what all the creditors' claims are within that 18-month period. It is possible that it wouldn't happen until after that. Sometimes people delay opening probate because of the grieving process. There's all sorts of things that can happen. Sometimes there are fights over who's going to be the executor of the estate, and that requires litigation. Our courts are already so overburdened that they cannot handle those things always within a what to the grieving parties would think is a reasonable period of time. So that's a timing process with regard to the claim. There's a reference in 563D15 to the payment of an allowed claim of an estate. There's no such thing in our estate process of allowed claims unless you have an insolvent estate that you've got administered, and then there's a whole insolvency process, but that's not referred to here. They just talk about an allowed claim. It's not clear to me that if there are assets in someone's trust that are available to pay the debts of an estate, that you have to go through the whole insolvency process, which is complicated and more costly. It's easier just to call them in because they're required to be called in under law. Having said that, I'll get to the problem that I had before. So I had a decedent who had an estate. He also had a trust. His trust owned a business. The business had very specific debts that it owed. After the guy died, the trustee paid the debts of the trust, started to gather information about the estate, come to find out the decedent hadn't paid his income taxes for years and his estate was insolvent. So they had to call in the assets of his trust. Well, the statutory scheme that we have now, and there is a statute that says the debts of a decedent are properly can be paid out of, or they're subject to, the trust is subject to pay claims of the estate for which the assets are insufficient. It doesn't say that debts and the assets of the trust are basically treated as a whole with the estate, and that everything gets paid pro rata. That is how the judge treated it in the case I had. I don't know that that's clear under the law, and in another case, we might have gone up before the Supreme Court. We did not do that on the one that we have here. Now we're adding with this statute another layer where you're talking about this deed that transfers property upon death can be subject to claims of creditors. Well, what priority? Is it pro rata with the assets of the estate that it would be applied? Do you have to use up all the assets of the estate and then you go to the trust first and then to the deeded property? Or how does all that work? That is not part of this, and I think that at some point that's probably going to come up. There are references in the statute, I think it's section 13, to it's paragraph 1, so 563D13 paragraph 1, it says, except as otherwise provided in the transfer on death deed, or in statutes governing anti-lapse, revocation by divorce or homicide, survival and simultaneous death, and elective share, if applicable to non-probate transfers. I'm unaware of any of those things being applicable to non-probate transfers as our laws currently stand, and I would suggest that it not be in there if it's not applicable right now, because you're just creating, I think, a suggestion and confusion to some people that maybe there's some opening there to make hay about those things. The creditor section also says that the estate enforces the claims against the property. Well, if you've got, as the very nice lady from Goffstown testified earlier, a single asset, you've got no probate. You're doing this to avoid probate. Who's the estate? Who's going to enforce that? Who's going to open that up? Is the creditor going to open that up? And then the creditor's going to charge all kinds of charges to open up the probate and to find people, and that's going to be a costly thing. There's also a reference in the creditor section to an allowance to a surviving spouse or child. We have those perhaps under intestacy, but there's an elective share that a wife can make against a will. And, you know, if the person has a will, but they just didn't have any assets to probate, how does that all play out? That's not clear and is pretty mucked up in the way the statute's written. The last thing is, under the creditor statutes that we have for estates, we have, it's a common law as identified by the New Hampshire Supreme Court that we all follow, and it follows a U.S. Supreme Court case, and it was something versus Tulsa. We call them Tulsa notices. So the normal statute of limitations for creditors' claims is to make those claims within 3 years. Under our probate statutes, as I discussed earlier, we have a short claims period. You have to file the claim with the probate within 6 months of the administrator's appointment, and then you have to pursue litigation on your claim within the following 6 months if you want to be guaranteed that you're going to get paid. We have to send out notices to the creditors to let them know of this short claim statute. There's no notice provisions here to notify creditors of this, and I could foresee a creditor saying, well, I didn't know within the 18 months, and therefore I get to have an exception here because you've otherwise changed my constitutionally allowed time period in order to bring a claim on the defaulted debt. I think that's all I have for today. I'm perfectly happy to work with anyone on integrating this because I don't oppose the concept, but I just think that we're probably creating a bunch of problems unless this gets cleaned up before it goes for a full vote.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions? Representative Chase, did you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I'm just curious, in the beginning of this, the testimony, or it was just said there was no opposing and this passed unanimously through the Senate. Did you testify in front of the Senate or any of these other issues? Were they brought up?
I did not. So I found out about this because there are a bunch of us who practice trust and estate law who have a committee, and we try to keep track of legislation, and sometimes we don't always find out about it when it first comes up, but we did find out about it and discussed it and came up today.
Representative Horgan.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the issue of probate being opened, and I noticed there's a case, there's a former state rep, Elaine Andrews Ahern from Hampton was her name, who died, I believe, in September, and I went to her funeral, and then I was surprised over 6 months later that the notice was just being now put out by the probate clerk. So is that longer than typical lapse for those notices in the newspaper, or is that shorter? Or it certainly is a significant amount of time after her passing.
I'm sorry, I was having some difficulty.
You might want to take your mask off to
Okay.
just speak into the mic so that you can be understood.
Thank you. I just happened to notice, one of the processes in probate is they put the notices in the newspaper, typically in the back pages of the Union Leader here in New Hampshire. So I noticed just a former colleague of mine who died over 6 months ago, her notice was just published a few days ago. So is that and that's a significant amount of time. So is that about average for the gap between when the person dies and when the probate process is opened, or is it usually shorter or perhaps even longer?
It can be shorter, longer. It just, grief is difficult and it is individual. And, sometimes there's a need to open it up quickly. Sometimes people want to get it done and over with. Sometimes people are so pained that they want to put it off. It really is dependent. I think most people get to it pretty quickly, but it really depends on the individual.
Thank you. You have a follow-up?
Yes. And I guess the purpose of those notices is just in case, one of the purposes of notices is just in case a deceased person owes you money, you at least have a theoretical chance of seeing it in the newspaper and being able to file a claim. So would you be losing that protection if we adopted this Transfer on Deed Act as is?
I don't know that there are creditors who peruse the notices that are filed by the probate courts to see who has died. I don't think that is sufficient notice to a creditor to require them to be bound by that short claim statute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Not. Thank you for testifying today. That is all the cards I have. Is there anyone else who wishes to testify? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 243 and thank everyone who appeared here today to testify. And we will move directly on to our next hearing, which is Senate Bill 344. Primary sponsor of Senate Bill 344 is Senator Daniels. And Senator Daniels, would you like to introduce your bill? I'm sorry we're running a little later than we expected, Senator Daniels, but having waited 2.5 hours for my hearing in the Senate the other day, I'm not feeling very sorry. So.
We probably owe you a little bit. I'll do what I can to try to get you back on track.
Thank you.
For the record, my name is Gary Daniels. I'm State Senator for District 11, encompassing the towns of Wilton, Milford, Amherst, and Merrimack. I'm also the sponsor of Senate Bill 344, which has to do with virtual meetings. I think we do what we can in these chambers to gain more participation in public affairs. Senate Bill 344 is an invitation to the public to better know what goes on in the political subdivisions of the state. It does not pertain to the general court. First and foremost, this bill is enabling legislation, something this body has historically supported. It enables the legislative body to decide whether or not they wish to allow their governing boards to meet virtually, with a stipulation that there must be at least a quarter of the governing board physically present at a specified location open to the public. It's an undisputed fact that over the past couple of years, the use of virtual meetings has increased public participation in local meetings, giving greater opportunity for the public to watch their elected officials perform their duties and interactively communicate with them. Last year, we passed House Bill 108. That bill authorized virtual meetings, but it was later changed to a study committee. Out of that study committee came a number of references that are built into this bill before you, including that a physical location remain a requirement, that a minimum of a quarter of the board shall be physically present at that location, that remote participation from members should be allowed in non-emergency situations with restraint, that the, quote, not reasonably practical standard for remote participation with documenting such reason in the minutes should remain, that all votes taken in a virtual meeting shall be by roll call vote, that instructions on how the public can access the meeting be included in the meeting notice, along with the means by which the public can notify the body if transmission to the public is interrupted, and that in the event of interruption, the meeting shall be adjourned until the public is able to access the meeting. These recommendations are contained with the bill, along with the additional requirement that a virtually participating member must have his or her camera actively displaying the member's face. It's time that we let the local community decide whether or not they consider virtual meetings beneficial in understanding how their local government operates. And to that regard, I respectfully ask that you support this enabling legislation and vote Senate Bill 344 ought to pass. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there questions for the senator? Seeing none, thanks for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Likewise.
Senator Perkins-Quokka. I promise not to shut you down today.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. So I am rising in support of SB 344. I had a digital meetings bill as well, SB 322, and Senator Daniels and I decided to combine our bills and work together on this version that is in front of you today. As we all saw firsthand during the end of the 2020 legislative session and the entirety of 2021, remote access to meetings provides a wealth of benefits. More people can participate in hearings and have their voices heard. People with differing abilities and health are ensured access without concern, and more elected officials can be the voice that their constituents elected them to be without worrying that employment, childcare, transportation will simply be a bar to them holding office. Towns can save administration and staff costs and better serve their residents. It's a local control issue as well. I've worked very closely with my friends from Districts 10 and 11 to craft an amendment that will empower local communities to vote to allow digital meetings. As passed by the Senate, this bill leaves 91A completely intact as it exists today and then simply adds a new section on the end which allows a vote by the legislative body of municipalities to expand access to remote meetings. As Senator Daniels mentioned, there are some parameters around how a municipality can expand local meetings, including having a quarter of the board physically present, making sure that if the public is unable to access the meeting due to a problem with the host, that the meeting is adjourned until that access is restored, and that all meetings held remotely must display a member's face and take a roll call vote. However, it will provide an option to municipalities to ensure that we're not forcing digital or remote meetings in situations where a municipality may not want them, but we're also allowing them for communities where this makes sense and where it can encourage diversity of participation by members of our public bodies. It is our opinion here in the Senate that this issue does not need further study, that we've all lived through this experience to great success, and we'd love to enable our towns and cities to continue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there questions for the senator? Yes, Representative Wolper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. The bill calls for a quarter of the total membership to be present at the physical location. Does that have any relationship to the quorum requirement?
It does not. The quorum requirement can still be set pursuant to local law.
You have follow-up?
Remote participants shall have their video on. Does that mean that in areas without good broadband, they can't conduct remote meetings?
So I think it's something that municipalities will have to consider, but in the Senate, the discussion was that we want to ensure that if remote meetings are to continue, that they are always in the spirit that, you know, we do the best discussing when we can see each other, when we can talk and make eye contact, that our elected officials are available to us. And so that was a bipartisan compromise to make sure that this bill, you know, reflected as a broad opinion as we could.
And a follow-up?
So the bill requires that if there are problems with electronic access, that the meeting be postponed. Won't that create substantial difficulties for the board or whatever that's meeting in terms of scheduling and meeting deadlines?
Again, this is purely adding an option, so it's a choice by a municipality to say, you know, we think that this remote style of meeting and making it available is important to us enough that we can accommodate you know, sort of the public notice and public access aspects of it. So in our mind, we limited to that adjournment to when there are problems with the host or the broadcaster. It surely does not include, I can't get my Zoom to work. So, you know, we wanted to make sure that it's in a limited situation, but that, you know, the public being able to attend remains an important piece.
You all set? Yep. And are there other questions for the senator? Representative McLean.
Just a quick question, Senator, with respect to scope. So a political subdivision, that doesn't bind, does that go to the legislature as well, or if that's not legislature, that's just cities, towns, boards, et cetera?
That's right. Thank you for the clarification, Representative. So there is a specific line in there just to avoid any ambiguity that this bill does not apply to the general court. It is simply towns, cities, counties, and other entities. There is conversation, I think prompted mostly by the Community Power Coalition, of their ability to use this bill to hold remote meetings. And so to do that, we would need an amendment to the current language to include instrumentalities created under RSA 53A, which I'm happy to talk to you further about. But just to answer your specific question, it does not apply to the general court. Thank you.
Other questions? Representative Horrigan.
Yes, the way I read this, this seems to put an end to a practice which was not well, somewhat common long before the pandemic came along and we started having Zoom meetings, and which was occasionally you would have a member participating in a hearing by speakerphone. So that would no longer be allowed if this bill passes, since the speakerphone doesn't show the picture of the person who's speaking.
It's a very good question, Representative. So I am not here to provide legal advice on it. The existing 91A would remain intact exactly as it is. If a municipality voted through its legislative body under this new section to expand the use of digital meetings, then pursuant to that section, it would need to include video access, yes.
Okay, other questions? Seeing none? Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.
I do have a card from Senator Prentice in support of the bill. Is she here? Don't see her. Karen Lyatt Hill.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Karen Leo Hill. I am the Grafton County Treasurer, but more importantly for the purposes today, I'm an 18-year city councilor from the city of Lebanon. I am here because over the past 18 years, I have seen the struggles that we have sometimes with. Can you hear me better? Okay. My name is Karen Leo Hill. I'm an 18-year city councilor in the city of Lebanon, and happy to be with you today and in support of SB 344. Over 18 years, I have certainly seen the struggles that we have with participation in public meetings, and it has been one of the silver linings over the last 2 years that remote meetings have enabled more people to participate more frequently. And I believe that actually our democracy has been strengthened because technology has been deployed in such a successful way. I believe that SB 344 is truly a path forward that will allow this greater level of participation while safeguarding our democracy. Things that are important to us: deliberation, the ability to engage with one another about different issues. As a member of the City Council over the last 2 years, I have observed firsthand that we have been able to grapple with discussions, with issues, even sometimes very controversial issues, such as a proposal to defund the police department by 50%. So we have engaged in some very tense, controversial discussions. We have been able to have that deliberation that was important to truly reflect what the people of Lebanon wanted and to be able to make decisions that represented many voices. So we've been able to have deliberation. I can recall back, I'll make this very practical. I can recall back 16 years ago when I was pregnant with my younger child, and there were times when at the end of a long day, I was just too tired. My ankles were too swollen to sit through a 3 or a 4 hour city council meeting. And unfortunately, I had to make the choice sometimes to stay home. Having the ability to participate remotely would have benefited me, and I believe would have benefited the constituents who elected me, and I would have, if this legislation had been in place at the time and the technology had been in place at the time, which I don't know if it was, I would have been able to continue in the public service that I had been elected to do while attending to my health concerns. I think the same would apply to people recovering from knee replacement surgery or hip replacement surgery, for example, as well. And so, in summary, I would just ask that you consider supporting this legislation. I believe that it is good for democracy. It is good for public participation. It is good for public service, while also safeguarding the most important parts and traditions of New Hampshire democracy, being deliberation, as well as having a physical space where a member of the public can come if they are not able or interested in participating remotely. So by having the physical presence, that is an important safeguard. By having the only issue I would say is the video on. I think until we truly have broadband, ubiquitous broadband in the state, sometimes you have to keep your video off to maintain the connection. So if anyone was open to an amendment, I might consider that would be the only area that I think an amendment might be prudent. But overall, I think this is a bill that safeguards democracy, honors the best of our traditions here in New Hampshire, but does move forward in allowing technology to support us in our efforts. Thank you very much.
Are there questions for Ms. Hill? Representative McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. Just in your experience, being a part of meetings for 18 years, the legislation says that you have to attend in person unless there is a reason that is, you cannot, unless it's not reasonably practicable. So in your experience, 18 years of public meetings, where would you draw the line? You mentioned the person who's got knee surgery, obviously they're bedridden, but where would you draw that line?
Well, I think it's a good question. Obviously, there's a certain amount of subjectivity in there, but the word reasonable is used throughout law, and there's a lot of litigation around what reasonable is. I think the spirit of the legislation is clear that in person is preferable. So there's a preference for being in person. And I think when people are elected, we take our jobs very seriously. And I think it certainly is my preference to be in person when I can. And so I would expect that people would interpret it in a rather restrictive way, that reasonableness would be things that have to do with health, things that have to do with physical accessibility. If someone is thinking that they may be exhibiting symptoms of something that they would like to be careful about spreading, I would assume it would apply to something like that. I don't think that it would apply to saying, oh, I have a scheduling conflict and I have to prioritize this other meeting. I don't think that would be, to me, that wouldn't be reasonable. I think when you're a public servant, that's part of what you've done. But I also think that there's a fail-safe built in here. If people are abusing this, presumably they won't be reelected, right? And so we have reasonableness that's going to be determined initially by that person, by that public official, but then we also have the voters who are ultimately going to determine whether they think that person has been using reasonable in a reasonable way.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming down today. Susan Cragen. Thank you. Margaret Burns.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Margaret Burns. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Municipal Association, and we are here in support of Senate Bill 344. As you know, and as has already been stated, during the pandemic when the state of emergency was in effect, Emergency Order Number 12 gave public bodies significant flexibility with regard to holding public meetings via virtual means, either entirely virtual or allowing more remote attendance than would normally be allowed under the current statute. After that emergency order was lifted, we continued to hear from members that they saw really great results from having that flexibility during the state of emergency. Not just the ability of elected officials to participate when there was a reason that kept them from being able to come out to the physical meeting space, but also many communities saw this incredible influx of the public attending virtually because it was simply easier for them to fit it into their lives and to engage that way, whether they were just listening to the meeting or whether they were also participating in public comment that way. And so for those reasons, our members have asked us to support legislation that would give more flexibility for remote meetings. Senate Bill 344 is an extremely narrow local option. So it is much narrower than Emergency Order 12 was, and it is much narrower than Senate Bill 344 originally was when it was originally filed. It is at its heart a local option. It says right there in line 3 that a legislative body must adopt this provision for it to be effective. So for the majority of our cities and towns, or for the majority of our towns, that is the voters at town meeting must adopt a warrant article that authorizes use of this local option. For the few town council towns and the cities that have the legislative body as their council or as their board of aldermen, that would be the body that would have the authority to adopt this local option, as would have the authority to adopt other local options. The additional restrictions have already been mentioned. You have to have a 1/4 present. The video must be on during the meeting. You must recess and adjourn if there's problems accessing the public meeting, and really a variety of safeguards in place meant to ensure that public meetings through virtual means are not used to disenfranchise either elected officials or the public, that they are actually used for the benefit of both the public and the public body. And just as this local option can be adopted, it can similarly be rescinded in the same manner via a legislative body action. It's very important too, and this will be my last point, that this bill does not affect any currently existing authority of public bodies under RSA 91A2. So I think Representative Horrigan asked, would this sort of undo the ability of public bodies to have the phone conference call remote participation that they've been using for a very long time, that has been in statute long before the pandemic and long before the state of emergency? The answer is no. This does not undo current authority to have a quorum of a public body present and allow a member or members to remotely participate. And it importantly does not allow the authority of a board to have an emergency meeting defined as when immediate and necessary action is required. It does not remove that authority to have an emergency meeting with less than a quorum physically present in those very narrow circumstances. So this is truly an additional authority tacked on to the end of 91A2, only to be exercised if the legislative body wishes to adopt it. And so for those reasons, we support Senate Bill 344, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions from Ms. Burns? Yes, Representative Wolper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. Legislative body must approve. Is that the council and the city council, or is that the voters, or the like same thing in a town? Is it the selectmen or the voters themselves?
In a town with a town meeting form of government, it is the voters. It is the people at town meeting who would have to vote on a warrant article. In our 13 cities, the legislative body is the Board of Aldermen and the City Council. So that would be the legislative body in those communities that would have the power to adopt this local option.
Thank you.
Representative Sylvia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. Getting back to the previous discussion of reasonably practical and the requirement that only a quarter of the public body needs to be there for a quorum. That means 3/4 of the body is reasonably, practically unable to attend. I have a hard time understanding what kind of reasonable and practical has 3/4 of the body missing.
One of the scenarios where it would apply is when you have a 3-member select board. Occasionally you have 2 members who are sick, or one who has just had surgery, or one who has childcare and must stay home with that child, and one who has COVID. And in those circumstances, the board wishes to continue to have its regularly scheduled meeting and conduct its business, but current law would not allow them to do that because they would need a quorum of 2 in order to be able to hold that public meeting. And so this really gives flexibility in those types of circumstances. And to the conversation about the terminology reasonably practical, I can tell you that at NHMA, we recommend that municipalities
construe reasonably practical narrowly, right? So cannot get out of something that prohibits them from physically being at the meeting space. Surgery, illness, they're a primary caregiver for a child or an adult, and they're unable to leave their physical location and come to the meeting space. And that is how we encourage public bodies to treat reasonably practical.
Thank you.
And weather.
Representative McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. My district has Litchfield and Manchester in it. So the way that this law is written, my constituents in Litchfield, I'm assuming it would be a ballot question that would come about. And so if the legislative body, the people of Litchfield, wanted to do it, they would have the voice to say yes or no. However, in Manchester, the citizens of Manchester, those constituents really wouldn't have that choice. It would be left to the board itself to decide. And if the citizens of Manchester said, no, we really don't want that, we really, this doesn't work for us, that voice is kind of denied to them under this bill. What would be your thoughts, about amending this to maybe say it has to be on a ballot question or something like that, for the cities and towns? Because I just see a difference with respect to fairness between the cities and towns and how it's implemented.
I guess my response to that would be that the voters are getting the voice in both circumstances, but they're just different types of government in those two different communities that you've referenced. So in Litchfield, yes, everything essentially goes to the voters at town meeting because that's the structure of government that has been adopted in that community. In the city of Manchester, they have a representative form of government, essentially, where that is the structure of the Manchester city government, and the voice of voters is going through their elected council members who act as the legislative body in that municipality. So it's consistent in both communities because that's the form of government, and that's the way that local options and ordinances are adopted in both of those two different types of municipalities.
Thank you.
Other questions? I guess one question, do you think it would be practical at all if you made it a requirement that the legislative approval be done on an annual basis?
I'm not sure I would object to that, because of course voters can, of course we're talking about a town meeting form of government, voters could petition at any annual meeting to rescind it, right? So if it was adopted last year and they don't feel it's working well or they don't want it anymore, a group of voters could put it on the warrant and get it rescinded. But the idea of having it being a standing renewal question, I don't see any immediate red flags with that idea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kate Horgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Kate Horgan. I serve as the Executive Director for the New Hampshire Association of Counties, which is all your elected and appointed officials at the county government level. We are in support of this bill, primarily for our association. We have a 50-member statewide board that has difficulties meeting their quorum requirements. We've already made changes in our bylaws that are allowable under law to make meeting our quorum easier. However, we still have problems. For example, on Friday, I may have to cancel my meeting because everyone's going to be away for Easter break. This would allow us to have our meetings and make sure that our business is conducted efficiently and effectively so that we can come here and tell you how legislation will impact governments. We also have over 15 subcommittees and affiliates that are all statewide. Susan Cragen, who's here, she works with the Register, she's the Register of Deed for Merrimack, trying to allow our 10 registers of deeds to get together to have an affiliate meeting when the Register of Deeds office is extremely overwhelmed with requests and information and deeds with all of the real estate exchanges that are going on now, would be great. Right now, they call an emergency meeting every couple months because they have to get together and they have to meet to make decisions, but that's the only way that they can meet. They can't take time away from their offices because they are so understaffed. It would also help out your local county governments. For those of you who are in the western and northern portions of the state, sometimes it can be snowing in one portion of the county and not snowing in another portion of the county, but we would still like to have our meeting, and allowing people to participate remotely would be very effective. I did participate with Representative Welper in the study committee on House Bill 108, and this bill does include many of the recommendations that came out of that study committee. This is a very narrowly targeted bill that will help us accomplish our work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions that the committee has.
Questions for Ms. Horgan? Representative Horgan.
Yes, with regards to the county, it's a little bit ambiguous who the legislative body for the county is. Is it the county delegation, or is it? But we have very limited powers, though. So would it be the county delegation, or would it have to be the entire legislature who sets the who would have to pass who would have to decide whether or not they want to use this procedure in their county?
At the county level, it is the county delegation, and Representative McLean, to answer your question, because Margaret and I literally just did this exercise for another committee, there is no practical way to put a warrant article and in front of every single community every single year. Take Hillsborough, for example. The towns vote in March. Some of them vote in May on the alternate town meeting day. Manchester meets every other year in October. There's no way to do that, and is that really the right place for questions to be decided by the county government at the town level? We would argue no, that should be handled by the county delegation. So if Hillsborough's county delegation decides, no, we don't want to have this remote meeting option, you don't have to do it. And I think that's the great thing about this bill.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to testify on Senate Bill 344? Seeing no one, we'll declare the hearing closed. And I think that concludes our business this morning. I'll just remind the Republicans that we do have a caucus scheduled for this afternoon at 1 o'clock in room 206, 208. Is there anything else that we need to address? And of course, for everybody, we have executive session tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock in our usual committee room. Thank you, everybody.